Thank you. Oh my God, you made it. Okay, so this is the last talk, so it could go one of two ways. It could be the most awesome talk and you're going to have, the kind of best memories of the conference, or I could kind of screw it up, basically, and then it would just kind of leave and go, God, this was terrible. So let's try and do the first one. This is me. As my compere mentioned a second ago, I volunteer with DataKind, and I also work on higher education data, which is not what I'm going to be talking about today. So, DataKind UK. So, who are we, what do we do, and what we've learned. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you who we are, a little bit more time about what we do, most of the time about what we've learned, because I think this is really the most interesting bit. So this is our mission, right? So to transform the impact of social change organizations through data science capacity building for the benefit of the people of the UK and other parts of the world. Basically, the real mission, which is a bit shorter, is to change the world with data. And the caveat there is to change the world for the better, right? So this is kind of what we're trying to do. And the way we're doing this is, if you think about all the skills that you guys have in the audience, the good news for you is that your skills are expensive. The bad news for social change organizations, and especially charities, is that your skills are expensive. They can't afford you. How do they go about crunching the data? How do they go about solving the problems that they're trying to solve? Well, they ask us for help is one of the ways to do it. And so those are all, or actually that's not all of them, it's some of the charities that we've been working with over the past 4 years. As you'll see, those are mostly charities that are based in the UK, so obviously not, many of you here might actually know them. Those are charities that focus on social issues. They're going to be, citizens advice that focus on legal advice for UK citizens and others. Centrepoint, a youth homelessness charity, a lot of homeless shelters, a lot of food banks, a lot of charities that really try and help people in need in the UK. So how do we help those organizations? Through 3 main programs. We've got some programs that we call office hours, where essentially we stand around, us data scientists and data engineer, and talk to the charities who come to us with their problems, often kind of fairly basic problems to do with data engineering, data management, data, governance, essentially. Then we have data dives and data core. The data dives are the main events that we do. We've got about 12 of them a year, and they tend to be essentially hackathons. We don't call them hackathons, but that's kind of what they are. They're data science hackathons. So on a weekend, you're going to have up to 100 data scientists who have nothing better to do with their weekend than doing data science for some reason, and so they show up, and then we team them together with charities who will come up with all the data that they've got and the questions that they want answered, and those people will work together to try and solve the problem in 2 days. No small feat. If the 2 days turn out to not be enough, if the data is very complex and the question that they're trying to address requires more time, which is often the case, we will then move to a data core, which is a long-term project, several months of work with teams of volunteer data scientists, again, working with the charities. So the common component in all of this, the 2 common components, the first is volunteers like you or I, so people with data skills, often data scientists, but data analysts, also people coming from social science, data engineers, and then the charities with people often who know data and who know the data that they've got, but who do not have the skills to really do very much with it. And those people work together and try and solve a lot of different problems. So the types of questions that the charities come to us with, and the kinds of questions that we tend to address, are questions that actually, for the most part, are not really specifically to do with charities. There are questions that any organization, even a for-profit organization, might be looking to solve. But those are actually those 4 questions that I'm going to go through. And the ways that charities approach those things, that's when it differs from the for-profit sector. So understanding the needs and demand, understanding users or clients, campaign effectively, and evaluate the services. So I'm going to go through those 4 points, and I'm going to give you examples of each of them so you can get a better idea of the type of work that we've been doing to address those points, and the people that we've been working with. So the first one is understand the need and demand. Now, this seems a fairly obvious one. You're a charity, you're trying to understand a problem, and you're trying to solve the problem, but before you solve the problem, you need to understand how big a problem it is. And in the first case, in the first example I'll give you, those are 2 maps that we worked on, and the people on top over there, Centrepoint. So Centrepoint is a youth homelessness charity based mostly in London, although they operate all throughout England. They're trying to address the problem of youth homelessness. And youth homelessness is, as any type of homelessness, a problem that has a scale that's very little known. So you might think, okay, so you're trying to put together a charity, you're trying to solve the problem of homelessness, whether it's youth or otherwise. You need to understand how many homeless people are in the country or in the region that you're trying to service, and then you might think, well, just look up the figures. What figures? There are no figures. By definition, and for two main reasons, there are no good figures. The first good reason is that a lot of homeless people tend to be off the radar, off the charts, so how do you track them? How do you even define homelessness? Because it's not easy. Somebody who's been sofa surfing over their friends for the past few months, actually that's a person who is a homeless person, but that doesn't mean they're sleeping on the street. So the definition problem is very hard to put together. And then the obvious other and more problematic reason behind the fact there are no figures is that this is a very political issue. So sure, if a government really wanted to address that problem and really wanted to get figures, they probably could. But what government is going to put together a huge amount of money and effort to actually come up with a figure that makes them look bad? Because the figure would make them look bad, right? This would be the result of a lot of the policies that they've been implementing. So there are no good figures. So what we did, what Centrepoint did, is they contacted all of those little kind of patchy little bits of the UK that you can see there. All of those are local authorities. They contacted them with a Freedom of Information request, and which says that those localizations have to go back to the charity with numbers. So they asked them, how many homeless, young homeless people do you have in your county, in your region? And the data came back, but this on the left is what it came back as. So as you can see, we have maybe about 50% of the local authorities who came back with data, and the data itself was something to behold, right? So some of them actually had formatted it properly, and for some cases it was actually an extract from the database, but for most of the time it was some kind of really weirdly formatted Excel file, and actually in a few cases it was some kind of quite bizarre text document from a Word document basically that came back with a few scattered numbers here and there. So this is the kind of data that came back, and a huge amount of the work that we had to do with the charity was actually extract structured data from that. And so what we wanted to do was come up with the map on the right-hand side, which is the result of the analysis that we ran together. And that map was the result of essentially a regression analysis that enabled us to infer the missing regions from the regions that we already had. So we came up with several regression models, and the best model that we came up with enabled us to fill in the blanks, essentially. As you notice, we left some areas out because those were not the areas of focus of the charity. And the numbers that we actually came up with were approximately 138,000 young people in the UK who are homeless, which is a startling figure. It is not at all the figure that the government had been claiming was the current number, and so this made a lot of noise. And what this did, so essentially I think it was about 12 times the number that the government was kind of given as an official number. So what this did was really enable the charity to go out there to funders, to local authorities, and to other stakeholders and tell them this is the problem that we're trying to address. Now you understand how big a problem it is. Now you understand just how much work it is for us and how much help we need. And if they don't have this idea of the scope of the problem, then they can't ask for help, right? And so this is a really key component of charities' work, and the work that they do with us is to understand exactly just how hard the problem is that they're trying to solve. So, understand need and demand. Now, understand who the users are and who the clients are. Now, obviously, another case of not having very good data to understand this. And the example I'm going to be showing you is some of the data that actually probably was the hardest to work with emotionally. And this data came from Buttle UK. Buttle UK is a charity that gives out about 10,000 small grants a year to some of the most vulnerable people in the UK. And those small grants are really not very big things. They're going to be giving them things that you take for granted. Cookers, fridges, these very small grants to enable them to actually have basic needs. And the data that came back from all of this application for grants was essentially text data with people describing the circumstances. And that has been tracked over time. So they had years and years of data, mostly text data that was describing the problems that people were facing and the reasons they needed the grant. So those were all grant application in text format. And so what we did is we ran an extensive natural language processing, kind of scraping of the data and kind of doing some topic segmenting and analysis of the links between the topics. And what came out with this was two things that were two kinds of things. Basically, some links that they knew existed before between the different topics that you can see, and some links that were quite new. And generally, it is kind of well understood in social science research amongst work on poverty and need and deprivation is that one problem leads to another, right? This is a succession of issues that lead from one thing to another. And so one thing that came out of this, by looking at the time of people applying for grants over and over, was that people who would apply for grants for reason of domestic violence would then later on apply for grants with issues to do with mental health in children, right? So this would be showing the effect of growing up in a household that was already a problematic household. Some other things came back that we didn't know about, and the Buttle UK have actually kind of done some further research into this, and one thing, for instance, was that the prevalence of bedwetting, so children wetting the bed, in households where there is a high amount of debt. So this kind of shows you the amount of the stress that gets passed around in a household, right? And a household is very vulnerable financially, and this kind of stress and this difficulty gets passed around to the children, who then in future will have further problems they will be applying grants for. So this kind of shows you just how intractable the problem of poverty kind of is. And obviously it's quite a difficult kind of data to work with, because you can think, well, how do I even start, right? But actually they have done some very good work to show that a small grant was enough to really help people out of poverty. You just help them kind of push that little step further, just help them with the next grant, or help them with actually having a cooker so that they don't have to buy really expensive kind of ready-made food, and actually that could help. So this was data that we worked on, and that was purely text data. And so we are very careful when we're working with text data, but this was one of the early examples where we did this. And that obviously helped the charity understand better who they were dealing with, and what kind of, what exact problems were that they were dealing with. So the third example is to do with campaigning. Now, campaigning is something that I think is probably quite specific, actually, to charities, and I don't know how much of this you could really apply to the private sector. Now, obviously, if you've got a product to sell, you will want people to know that you've got a product, and you will want people to understand why they need your product. But arguably, the issue of campaigning for charities is slightly different, because they will want everyone, the public, to understand that the problem that they're addressing is a massive problem, and they will want public support for that. They will want public awareness, otherwise they'll operate in the shadow. And a charity that we worked with, whose sole purpose and mission is campaigning and advocating for kind of better practices, is Global Witness. Global Witness is actually quite a nice follow-up to the talk that we had before from Pierre. So Global Witness are an international NGO who conduct extensive investigation and publish reports mostly to do with corruption. And they tend to focus on corruption and the links between natural resources, conflict, poverty, and corruption, and human rights abuses. So they publish very extensive reports, some of which are mostly just based on investigative journalism, some of which are more based on data that can come out, such as the Panama Papers that Pierre mentioned. They actually did a lot of work using this as well. And the work that we did together was looking at data that actually had been published by the UK government. And this is data to do with the ownership of companies. So I think Pierre actually mentioned briefly in his talk earlier the issue of shell companies. So what we focused on was understanding better who were the anonymous companies in the UK, and potentially how we could help the government have a system for flagging those companies in the database that they've already got. So anonymous companies exist mainly to disguise people doing things that they would rather not have the public know about. So they're legal, right? All of this is operating in the gray zone of legality, and this is why it's so tricky, because nothing there is actually strictly illegal, but it's basically what we call dodgy. And so the anonymous companies are usually not engaged in any actual business, but they're there to provide cover for people doing potentially shady things. And what you can end up having with a shell company is somebody owning a company, but that's going to be registered in some kind of fiscal paradise, and that company owns another company, who owns another company, who owns another company, and then you've got a link of 20 companies until you actually discover who really is involved in this. And the data that the UK is gathering on companies obviously is mostly to do with the data in the UK itself, but it does also have data on companies registered abroad. And so we put together some work, mostly I think it was in Neo4j, where we tried to map a network of the ownerships. And we found a few things when we started exploring this data that were very troubling. One thing was, for instance, that names would pop up over and over and over again. And this could be a data entry problem. Obviously, the problem of understanding identity through, in data is extremely difficult, right? There is not a single number that says this is that person and this is that person. So you can very often have data that will come back. So somebody earlier in the questions actually said, why do you always talk about Trump? Well, I'm sorry, but here's one more. And so over here in the green little dots, which you probably can't see, and actually this is, I see Andy smiling here. It's like, yes, I told you about this earlier. People at the back cannot see your slide. I'm sorry. so right, now I feel like I've completely screwed this up. It is Trump. Now you can believe me because I've actually seen the slide and I can see it on my laptop. But it's Trump according to different spellings of the name. So the data cannot actually recognize that person as a single entity. And as Pierre would say, the reason I'm highlighting Trump is not because I have anything against the guy. In fact, I think he's the cleanest guy ever. But because he just happens to show up in the data. And on the top left there, with the kind of little gray circle around it, that's him as well. And so this is an example of some of the charts that or the graphing that we put together. And so in green, you have the actual names, so the named entity. And in blue, you've got the locations. And then you're going to have some kind of fairly uncertain kind of items in yellow where you've got some kind of codes where you're not sure whether this is a company or what. And then in purple, you've got company names. And so when you start looking a bit further into this data, what you realize is that there are a lot of elements in the structure of this graph that could potentially work as a good indicator that something wrong is going on. And so some of the things come not from the network, but from the data itself. So you would have cases where somebody who has not been born yet owns a company. Pretty weird. You would have cases where someone owns 4,000 companies, or a location where 4,000 companies are registered, which actually does exist in the UK and is actually legal. And essentially, this is a location where people will just create shell companies that are empty and that don't have anything to do yet, and then they will sell them really cheaply, again, to hide potentially business practices. So all of those are elements that you could actually spot if you started doing some structural analysis on the chart. And one of the analysis that you could be doing is looking at circular control structures. So you would have a company that controls another one that controls the one that we were talking about in the beginning. Or you can have circles of just one single company that controls itself on top there, and then on the right-hand side, you've got a kind of circle where everybody controls each other, and then you've got just certain triangles. So we worked together with Global Witness over a project about 6 months long. So we put together this dashboard where we would enable people who actually query, and especially at the beginning, the idea was that the journalists from Global Witness will be able to do that, so that they can dig deeper into the data. But the purpose of this was eventually to make this a public tool so that everyone can actually do that themselves on the Companies House website, or at least on a website that would be reading the Companies House data. So we came up with 2 ways to actually identify, 2 elements of potentially kind of shady practices identification. One was looking at circular companies, which was just basically identifying cases where a structure was circular in some way. And the other one, actually, there was a lot of other ones, and so those are all the red flags that we came up with. And so we built a system that would actually count the number of red flags, what we called red flags, which were defined as situations in the data and in its structure that would suggest potentially something going on. And this would not actually flag the company as definitely problematic, but it would allow for journalists to then go into those companies' details and look it up. Because, as Pierre mentioned, when you've got this kind of level of data, the size of the data we're talking about, even though this is actually just UK companies, it's pretty much intractable for a person to know what to look for. And that's kind of always the problem with journalism dealing with data sets of that size, sorry. And so some of the red flags we have is the company which is registered at a company factory, which is those companies I'm talking about with 6,000 companies registered at the same address. The company officers are politicians, so we've got almost 400 of those. This is potentially completely legitimate, but it's always kind of interesting looking into exactly the conflict of interest that you can have, right? Which could lead to corruption. A company frequently changes its name, so you actually have also the ability to check how often the name is being changed in the database. The company is controlled via trust, or the company or the person of significant control is based in a secrecy jurisdiction, such as the Bahamas, the British Virgin Islands, etc. So we built all of this dashboard based on data that is actually completely public and that everybody can check. But what this did is enable Global Witness to have a better idea of where to target their efforts. But another result that it did is actually that by looking at this data together, we identified the limitations of the data, and we identified cases where we thought, well, if only the Companies House in the UK, so the kind of official body that deals with this data, if only they'd gathered data in a slightly different way, or if only they'd requested that one field slightly differently, or if only they'd done some kind of, for instance, we have a country drop down, for instance, right? And then you would have a free text field where people could enter any country they wanted if they couldn't find theirs. So you can imagine, A, why would you want to do that? Because how many countries are there? You can count them. You can have a drop-down. B, you end up with a massive amount of free text that makes no sense, and you have to map it all, probably manually, or if not manually, pretty close to, with some kind of horrible regular expression, back to something that you think is structured. So, why would you even do that in the first place? So those kind of limitations of the data were actually, we went back to the Companies House, and this is actually a so that was the House of Commons, and they actually had a meeting talking about the result that came back from the Global Witness analysis. Global Witness actually do have very strong links with the government, and though they do advise them on how to best basically gather data on companies' ownership and what to do with it. And so this was kind of something that we really wanted to have a strong impact. And as you can see, they actually mentioned that Global Witness suggested some changes into the data and actually highlighted some cases. So Companies House in the UK actually went back and changed some of the ways that they gather data, which was a huge achievement. And then there were also some cases of crackdowns from the UK legislators. So cases where it turned out that actually they were, I think it basically raised a lot of awareness as to what companies can be doing, what kind of practices can be the companies' practices that are just not the most transparent, essentially. And so there was a crackdown on Scottish limited partnerships, which were to do with essentially kind of extreme tax breaks for companies in Scotland, and kind of limited just how much the companies were really having to reveal. So this was another impact. And the UK then adopted an EU law on combating terrorism and money laundering. So really the purpose behind a lot of the extremely shady practices that you can sometimes spot in the data is very often going to be money laundering, and this is really what Global Witness is trying to do. They're trying to identify cases of corruption and money laundering through, essentially money changing hands, through capital changing hands by company from company. So this was an example of basically the work that we did together with Global Witness so that we could put our efforts together. They had the know-how, they had the understanding of what was problematic, they knew what in the past had turned out to be a good lead for an investigation. We knew how to structure data, we knew how to spot errors in the data, in kind of data gathering processes and data governance, and we also knew how to build graph databases, and so we put all this effort together, and we came up with this, which Global Witness have actually got now quite a few data people on board to do this on a kind of full-term basis, and they really are pushing this work very far. And they're definitely, they have been since then very grateful for the work that we did, and they've kind of taken it one step further, and now they kind of don't need us anymore. And that's really the purpose of a lot of the work that we do. We want to be there to help an organization do something that we think actually they could do themselves. It's just they haven't really kind of figured out how to get it together. But once they have embarked on that mission to make the most of the data that is available to them, whether it's their data or external data in that case, then they can carry on and do the work. So this leads us to the last point. And the last type of question that companies come up to us with is, we would like to evaluate our services. We would like to understand how well we're performing, and whether we could perform better, and how we could perform better, and the areas where we're not performing well. This, as opposed to the one previously where I said I thought this was quite charity-focused and charity-specific, this is definitely not. So any for-profit organization will be doing that as well. But we're going to be, I'm going to be showing you an example of how we did it with those guys. And so this is the Welcome Center. They're a food bank and much more. So they're based in the UK, and they provide support to people in crisis, offering practical help in the form of food, toiletry, and household support packs. So those food banks have been in existence for a very long time in the UK, and I'm sure in many other countries, and I'm sure also in Hungary. Actually, it was really nice knowing that some of the food we were not eating was going to people in need. But unfortunately, and this is kind of something that I think another case of kind of fairly shameful kind of government results. Essentially, if you go to a government and you kind of show that I don't think anyone can argue that this is remotely okay, right? And so what you've got on this chart is the referrals in blue, so the number of people who have been referred to the Welcome Center. So people who've been put in touch with the Welcome Center because they are in need of some food, but not just food, I mean basic day-to-day essentials, and then number of packs distributed in orange. And so you can see that, so it starts in December 2015, it ends pretty much a few months back, that was in June 2019. And so over basically a period of 4 years, it's been slowly increasing, and it kind of took a real rise around the beginning of 2018. And so this is just one, right? And it's not even the biggest by far, right? So there are just tons and tons of dozens of those charities in the UK, and they are distributing more and more food, more and more essentials to people. And this is rising, right? And it's not just a kind of little glitch in the data that the Welcome Center has. It has been rising. It has been recognized by the media as something that is rising. And I mean, there has been a lot of debate behind why this is rising. Why are people so much more in need now than they used to be? Partly, what they've seen is that more and more users are actually people in employment. So those are not people who don't have a job. They have a job, but the job doesn't pay, or the job is on 0-hour contract. Now, I don't know what kind of employment legislations you have in Hungary. In the UK, we've got this thing called a 0-hour contract, where basically you're contracted, but you're not, because actually your employer could decide tomorrow that you don't need to come into work because they don't have any customers in, and so actually you don't have any hours, so you don't get paid for that. So you can't rely on anything. And this is more and more prevalent, and this together with the increase of the gig economy, where you could just be basically driving an Uber for hours and hours and not know whether you're going to make any money, that basically brings us to the point where a lot of people who are in employment do need some extra help. And there's also been some universal credit reform, which have to do with how the government actually distributes benefits to people. And those reforms have been very controversial, and I won't bore you with the details, but I'm unfortunately pretty sure that this is not something that only happens in the UK, and that's why I think it's probably just as relevant to you. I know there's many countries where this is happening, and it tends to be a fairly common pattern. So what we've seen when we started looking at the data that the Welcome Center had was that actually there's not a huge amount of, so the number of visits, so in blue on the left you've got most clients who visit relatively few times, right? So generally clients come, or we call them clients. I know it's a bit of a weird word for somebody who by definition is not buying anything, right? But this is kind of the terminology used in that case. So they will come very few times. They will come once in a while, once a year, or they won't come back again. And this is what you would want to see. You would want to see someone who at some point needs your help, but then doesn't need it anymore, right? Now, what is worrying is people who do come back on a regular basis and who actually use more of the kind of percentage of the amount of support that you can offer. They use more than they should, really, essentially. They keep coming back, and they use a huge amount. So those people are very dependent on your services. And this is very dangerous, because ultimately, those food banks are not meant to be there as something that supports people throughout their life. They're there to support them in moments of need. But if people keep coming back over and over, that means there is a huge problem there that is not being addressed. And potentially keep, kind of having them depend on you is actually maybe not a good idea. It's kind of a perverse thing. And so what they wanted to do was come up with a model that would help them understand if somebody coming to them was likely to become dependent on the services or not. And if they were, then they could actually reroute them or advise them in different ways. So this is the regular way that the things happen. So somebody comes in, they're being referred by phone, and then the volunteer puts together a lot of data in the system. So they put some data on the user, their age, their situation, and whatnot, and all kinds of other details that will help us determine more kind of demographic information. The food parcel or food or other is prepared, and then the parcel is collected by the client. So this is the kind of general, normal kind of way that things are done. what the Welcome Center are doing is they're trying to do a supported journey. So instead of just giving them the food parcel and saying, thank you, goodbye, see you next time, or hopefully not, they actually do have a fairly kind of thorough interview with them where they really try and understand what's going on in this person's life. Why do they need the help? And so this open-ended, flexible support is completely client-focused, which means it's not tied to KPIs of the charity or whatever. They're not just trying to kind of like make sure that they solve X number of problems or whatever. It's about helping that one person. So they help them with full completion, they help them with advocacy, they will put them in touch with other support groups or other charities. So for instance, some kind of legal charity, if they think that actually, those people are maybe, I don't know, being kind of asked to pay for rent that they shouldn't have to or whatever. So there's all kinds of other things that can go wrong in somebody's life for them to need a food parcel. And so the charity will try and help them access other services that could be helpful. And so what they wanted us to come together, to come up with, was a way that they could get a better idea when somebody comes, whether or not that person was likely to become dependent. And so what we built was a model that used the information that we knew about the person and the kind of general patterns that we had observed in the charity's historic data to predict the future usage. And so this future usage was based on the factors that you can see here. So the client's gender, known issues, ethnicity, family, current referral, so what is going on at this very moment when they've actually applied, previous referrals if there are any, and potentially from other agencies, because we obviously would, in that case, try and actually work together with more than just that one charity. The charities will try and actually share the data as much as possible, and the referral pattern. So this helped us put together a system where we basically came up with a probability score that this person was likely to become a dependent user or not. But this probability score was not used on its own. It was also used in conjunction with the previous probability score. So what we would do is kind of take the derivative, essentially, of the probability so that we would understand the likelihood that this person was becoming more and more dependent, or less and less so. Because if the probability was decreasing, that means that this person is potentially moving away from dependency. And if it is increasing, then this is where you need extra support. Because not only is this person likely to come back, but they're likely to come back kind of more and more often, essentially, or the likelihood is increasing. And so you will definitely want to sit down with them a bit longer. You will want to put together some better partnerships with specific other charities that can help that person be redirected to the other services that they need. So this was put together from all of those characteristics. And if you're curious what the model was that we used, that was a random forest. And obviously the limitations of a random forest is that you can't really go and explain exactly why each criteria led to the result. So that's one reason why perhaps that would have kind of gotten in the way of explainability, but it did lead the best results. And we actually did get some very good feedback from the charity. So the charity gets, to give you an idea of scale, about 40 referrals a day. And about half of them come from new clients, right? So about half of them, that means basically come from people who have applied before. And so we've kind of, from what they've told us and from people using it, they have told us that there's very few false positives. So obviously all of this, and I think it's kind of key generally to all the work that we do, is all of this is data that is enabling people to make better decisions, but it's not really, although it's kind of highlighting a certain problem, it's really relying on their expertise. We cannot replace human decision-making, and especially not in cases like this where there is so much at stake, right? So making the wrong decision could bring very serious problems. So this is really there to help the social workers. The anecdotal evidence that the Welcome Center gave us, what the support worker does trust the recommendation, and that generally and they no longer spend time on manual checking. So they basically check that the machine is doing the machine's job, and then they can focus on the human job. And after 9 months, the system is now actually become an integral part of the Welcome Center, which is quite unusual. And I hope to tell you, like a lot of the programs that we put together, when we come up with the solution, it's really, the hardest bit is to get the charity to implement this, to get it to implement it, to use it, and to carry on using it. Because we don't really have the capacity to perform, like to provide continued support. And so it's kind of a training thing where you just give somebody, we're going to give them a package, we're going to give them something that's as kind of ready to use as possible. But if they don't really have the skills, and if they don't have the time, or if they just if not everybody's buying into it, like the people you worked with, they're going to think it's great, but actually the main person in the charity, you don't have kind of top-down buy-in, so they're going to look at it and say, right, okay, this sounds fun, but this is just going to be so much work. Can we just carry on doing things as we were before? And so having cases like this where the charities are you really using what we've put together and furthering it and changing their business practices to actually fit around this is huge, because it means that they are becoming much more data mature. They've actually kind of reordered the way that they structure either the kind of just the kind of structure of the company or the data that they're processing, so that it fits with the outcomes that we've designed for them. And so this has been quite a good success story for us, and they're carrying on using it. And obviously those are not kind of finished work, right? The charity will come back to us often with questions. We carry on working with them over the long term if we can. Sometimes they come back for more with a different question, with a different project. But the Welcome Center have been like one of our biggest success stories. So I've gone a little bit through the kinds of questions that a charity asks us. They want to understand what problem they're facing. They want to understand who's facing the problem they're trying to solve. They want to campaign better, and they want to make sure that they're serving the right people. But there's kind of a little caveat that I want to get into now. And I mean, it's not so much a caveat as something that we need to think about whenever we put data together. And this thing is the problem of ethics in data. And the problem of ethics in data is something that affects all of us working with data. But when you're working with data from those charities, it comes on specifically strong, because a few reasons for that. One of them is that often the data we worked with is not data that's big. Forget big data. This is not big data. I mean, apart from facts where we're looking at companies' kind of ownership data or things to do with the leaks in Panama Papers, and this is big data. But the stuff I've been showing you, for the most part, is not. It's actually data on a few thousand people for a few years, and those people are people who are very vulnerable. So the issues to do with ensuring proper anonymization are huge, and it's very difficult to anonymize that kind of data, because by definition, those people have very specific circumstances, the location they live in, there might not be very many people in that one place, so you can kind of try and anonymize the best you can, but really you're never going to get to the point where your data is completely anonymous. But because of the vulnerability of the people, it is something that we have to take very seriously. And so one thing that we ask ourselves when we put those programs together is the what if, right? What could possibly go wrong when we put something together? So what if the model is wrong about which users don't need extra support? So this is giving you examples of the questions we had to go through in the Welcome Center example. So distributing food parcels, what if we get it wrong? What's going to happen? And this is something we need to discuss with the charity. So in that case, they could say, well, actually, if you get it wrong, then potentially, somebody who needs extra support, I'm not going to be putting so much effort into giving them that support, so there is a risk there, right? So, and this is a risk that we need to be quite transparent about with the charity, so that they understand and they readily accept that there are limitations to what we can do for them. Another question would be, what if the model is implemented without a human? And this, to me, probably is actually one of the worst ones, because thankfully, so far, it's not happened, because people tend to be quite skeptical, and especially in the charity sector, where they know that the expertise they have is not going to just magically be replaced by a robot, and they're confident of that, so they don't take it without criticism. You will give them a score probability or something, and they'll go, okay, right, now I trust that you've done your job here, but I'm going to apply my own human kind of verification on this. And it's really important that those things are done in conjunction. So generally in the work that we do, we don't have too much worry there, but in the work that some other companies would do, or just companies generally, then this can be a bigger problem, right? I mean, we've kind of barely touched upon, I think, earlier on the issue of recidivism and deciding whether or not somebody was likely to be a recidivist and whether or not they should be getting parole, which is this kind of huge thing that ProPublica looked into. And this is a case of somebody just making a call pretty much based on the computer's result, and this very, very hard to go back into understanding why that decision was reached, right? So those are real problems that occur in current uses of data-supported or even data-driven decision-making. A third problem would be, what if the model is used to ration food bank support rather than refer to additional support? So the idea with the model we put together was that it wouldn't make you, if the probability was low that you would become dependent, it wouldn't make you get less help. It would just, we would then, not necessarily put you in touch with all the other stuff, but the actual work of the charity itself would not be reduced. But I mean, I guess this could be a problem, right? So we needed to check with the charity that they were not going to be using it to remove everything. It'd be like the absence of extra positives rather than some negatives coming in. And then obviously, and this is kind of the big one in data use and data-aided decision-making, is what if the model entrenches or expands potential biases among certain community and groups. And this is always a huge problem, partly because the data that we tend to have is already biased, and especially when you're dealing with data sets of the size I'm talking about, those are very small data sets. So if there are biases, if there is misrepresentation or insufficient, I mean, especially your sampling is just going to be terrible. You've got maybe 1,000 people, they're coming from very vulnerable backgrounds. Those are not a representative slice of the society at large, right? This is by definition not representative. And so how do you make sure that your model doesn't then kind of rely too much on a certain characteristic? And so this is something that also we are working with the charities on, but we tend to, unfortunately, I don't think there is any ideal way to avoid those problems, but I think it's very important to be quite transparent about them. To make sure that that the data doesn't get kind of misused, but also that charities in general that we work with understand and are aware of the limitations of what can be done with data. And so that's the kind of issues of data ethics and the use of data for those purposes, and potentially what could go wrong. I think that's really something that we should always be asking ourselves when we work with data. And those what ifs, I mean, to some extent, they can all be applied to any kind of system that you design that's going to make a decision. And it's quite important to make sure that the stakeholders are aware of those full what ifs. So I think I'm going to stop here and potentially take some questions if there are any. I hope that this has inspired you somewhat. Now, I know this is quite UK specific, and I put a dog in there because this is the last talk, and so I thought this should be a dog. And so if, I'm like I said, this is really UK focused, but I'm sure that, in Hungary as well, there are tons of organizations that are trying to solve problems, and they don't have the resources to solve them. And all of you here probably have resources, and by resources, I mean brain resources, skills. And so, I really hope that this has inspired you to go out and use your skills for good. Thank you. You're right.
Almost.
Oh, thank
Almost.
you. Ooh, what's that?
And we do have
Fancy.
questions.
We have questions, wonderful.
Yes. The first question comes from Jaron. Do you notice the difference in how these nonprofit organizations are organized compared to the profit sector? What can the profit sector learn from them? Ooh,
that's interesting. So the difference, I mean, it really does depend. So this is such a data science response, isn't it? It depends. So we've got the big charities, and they don't tend to be like the very big one, like Amnesty International, Oxfam. They tend to be organized in a fairly similar way, I would say, to large companies. But the very small charities are not, and the very small charities partly because they just come up, like they have very little funding, and they're just a group of people working together trying to solve a problem and just not necessarily having a huge amount of resources, and they tend to be very local as well. So those can be quite different in terms of. So that means basically they have few resources, but I guess what the profit sector could learn from them. I mean, I guess ideally, my ideal of a world in which the for-profit sector is on from the non-profit is to stop making a profit, but that's probably not for this conversation. But I think generally they could just understand what drives these people, right? People who work in a non-profit sector they're there to solve the problem, and that's really what they're trying to do. And so I guess one thing that you could go out to your boss with is, well, what problem are we trying to solve here? Are we trying to solve a problem? And trying to make sure that what it is that you're doing is actually solving a problem and not just creating a problem, which I think happens quite a bit.
Absolutely. Sounds like there's some interested data scientists in the crowd, and they're wondering, can volunteers work with you remotely?
This is yes, I think. To be honest, I'm not completely sure at the moment whether we're completely equipped to do this, but we have, like some of the works that we do. I mean, we need people to kind of be, with us once in a while, but they don't have to be with us all the time. And some of the data core projects that we've done, even though people were there maybe like once a month, and the rest of the time they were remote. So we already, we have a very massive kind of London bias, unfortunately. So we're already trying to expand across the UK. But in theory, if people were able to, to connect with us quite regularly, even from a different country, I think this could potentially work. And so I would refer you to the, it's gone. Well, anyway, the slide with the info thing. To ask my boss over there, yeah.
Fantastic. Do you know of any initiatives like DataKind in Hungary?
I do not. Do you? I guess this is a question that I push back to the audience, but no, I do not know. However, it's very possible that they are, and I also kind of want to mention that sometimes the public sector actually does put together some of the skills of their own workers for charity work. So I know that this is something that our friend at Tableau do, for instance, and so this also could be something that happens. So I'm not aware of it, but I hope it does occur.
Are there any entrepreneurs in the audience?
Yeah, exactly.
What % of applicants actually get selected to volunteer with DataKind?
Pretty much 100, I would say. I mean, it depends in what capacity, but when we've got what we call the data dives, essentially you sign up, you show up, you do the work. It's not a selective process, and then if it turns out that this is just too difficult for you, don't have the skills, then hopefully you will learn skills in the process. I mean, we're not prescriptive about this. And then people who kind of like me who've been around for like 4 years, then we just. It just ends up filtering up. Like, if you're really interested in working with us, then you can work with us like this. I've never said no to anyone.
How do you decide which project or charity you will work with?
Yeah, this is a really, really good one. So we have what we call a scoping committee, which sounds fancier than it is, but really it's us just crunching through applications for hours and hours. And the key things that we're looking for is, first of all, some level of data maturity, because if you don't have, like, if the organization is not at all ready to start this kind of thinking data-driven, then it's just not going to happen. And very often the data you're going to get is going to be a nightmare to work with. So often we come back with them if they're not data mature enough and say, hey, maybe do this first, and then we can work together. The other thing is we try and make sure that the data that they have and the problem they're trying to get us to answer are going to work together, right? That actually we can get something out of this, because sometimes it's just like a free-for-all and get no idea what we're looking for, and we don't think we're going to be able to solve it. And then also we try and make sure that the whole charity is behind this. So like I mentioned earlier, if you've got a few people at the top who don't care about what we're doing, and then actually the people that you're interacting with don't have connection with those people, then the impact is going to be very small. So we also look at this.
Okay. Pierre is wondering, are you publishing the work somewhere on the internet, like GitHub?
Yeah, we try. Now, as you can imagine, when you've got 70 people working on code over a day and a half of the weekend, getting them to push cleanly to GitHub, well, and I'm not going to talk about even the pull request problem, but it's a pretty challenging thing, and to get into documents is challenging, but we try. So we do definitely have some of the big projects, we have a GitHub for it, so it's probably, if you Google GitHub DataKind, I think you'll probably find us there. Some of the smaller term projects, we don't always have all the code ready, but we try.
Okay. Could you name some of the currently running projects?
Ooh, this is a good one. Well, who do we, I think, at the moment, I'm not sure about the exact names of the charities that we're working with at the moment, because it tends to kind of roll on from month to month. One big thing that we're trying to grapple with at the moment is try and define a framework for accepting to work with text data. Because as I mentioned, this is a very problematic kind of thing, and sometimes the text data that comes back is really impossible to anonymize, and it's just completely unstructured, and it can also be quite upsetting for volunteers, because it can be, we had like a charity come to us with like text data from calls from a child support service, and the stuff that was coming out of this was just, it was harsh. And so we're trying to define a framework for better, for like the kind of ethics of working with data and making sure that it's okay for everyone. So this is a big work that we're looking at the moment.
Okay. And are most of the people working with DataKind part-time volunteers? how do you complete bigger projects without consistent technical capacity?
So yes, they are all volunteers so there's only 3 people who are actually salaried at DataKind, and I'm not one of them. And so yeah, I'm part-time volunteer. Most people are part-time volunteers. Most people have a day job and then they do that on the side. And then although some people are a bit more flexible, and so generally we just ask for people to have a commitment of, let's say, 10 hours a week. If it's a data call, it's going to be like, right, 2 nights a week. You're going to need to be available for 2-3 hours. And so we get that from them, like from the beginning. Often some people will drop out, along the way. So it's quite challenging. But we do try and be as transparent as possible from the beginning about just how much time you need to put in there. And if you're just coming for a data dive, then all you need is a weekend. So it's not necessarily a huge time commitment.
Time for a couple more. How do you help a charity that comes to you but doesn't have the technical people required to collect the raw data you need?
Well, I mean, that kind of depends what you mean by required to collect the raw data, because they will have data. I mean, if they come to us, they have data. Any charity that does any work right now has some kind of data. Now, the data might be patchy, it might be small, it might also not go back many years, so it might just be very, you forget about cold start problem. This will be like, well, we have this 1 year of stuff, what can you tell us? And it's like, not very much, right? But you can always do a little bit with that. And often what we found is that charities, even who have a very small amount of data, just a little bit of data, like crunching and visualization and basic statistics on what they have can be very useful. And then actually just giving them ideas of how to collect it, because the skill, the thing is, you don't need very hard, it's not very, very hard to collect data in a certain way, right? So often those skills we can, even if they don't have data analysts, we can help them do it better. So I think we can always kind of find something to help them with.
And maybe one more. So have you tried to identify the root causes of homelessness using data science and use that data to identify groups of people where prevention could help?
Wow. This is a tough one. So some of the work that we did when we were trying to put together the map of youth homelessness kind of gave us some ideas of causation. And again, I'd be careful about talking about causation correlation. But for instance, one of the regions that had very, very high level of youth homelessness and that had increased was regions where public housing was being sold privately. So where basically the public housing stock was being depleted, and this is due to some kind of very controversial government policy. And so we have actually, as part of this work, found some cases of not something you would immediately think about, but issues that tend to link with homelessness and potentially could be causes of that. But and then other things like I mentioned with Buttle UK, when we looked at things that make that endanger kind of young children and make them very vulnerable. If their parents are in a lot of debt, then they will themselves become kind of mentally a bit more unstable and kind of more stressed. And so this would often be a cause for future homelessness, right? So there are many root problems, unfortunately. But yeah, I don't know if we can solve that.
Yeah, don't think it's that easy, but
yeah.
We're out of time. Thank you very much. Round of applause.
Thank you.